I did resent very much the Japanese government, and I think most of us felt that it was a very, very dastardly thing to do. You have your people over here talking peace with us and so forth, and then you have planned this attack for months on end. I mean, it was just a terrible thing as far as we were concerned, but it was the catalyst.
Welcome to Triumphant Spirit, America's World War II Generation Speaks. This program is a series of broadcasts featuring the stories of a generation that fought and won the Second World War. No matter how they fought the war or where, on the home front or the battlefield, each veteran featured on the program contributed valiantly to a victory that changed the 20th century. Here are their stories in their own words. They are stories of actions and deeds that not only helped shape the outcome of the war, but the very world we live in today. Christine, you were in elementary school when war broke out in Europe in 1939. Can you describe for us what your world was like as adults around you tried to make sense about what was happening?
Yes, I can, basically because my dad was an Italian immigrant. He came over, I think at the age of 5, and we were very conscious of the fact that he was a naturalized American, and we knew that Italy was one of the countries that was fighting with the Axis against the United States, and we were very, very conscious of showing that we were true Americans and we did not hold with what was happening over in Italy. In 1939, my father ran, well, I guess it was in 40, he ran for the United States Congress. And it was a very interesting time for us. He was elected, and he represented the 13th Congressional District in New York City, downtown Manhattan. And the area which he represented and in which we lived in a nucleus of an Italian district, and we were surrounded on to the east by very strong Jewish background people, or actually Jewish people, and to the south of us we had the Chinese district, to the west we had the Irish, and a little further north we had the German. So we were all thrown together very often. I went to school with these people and so forth. And we were all very conscious of the fact that many of us were almost considered enemies because of the fact that we had this heritage. And we were very, very much concerned. And we heard, of course, that we did not want to be dragged into this war. And we had to be very careful that, yes, we sided with England and so forth, but this was not our war. And I think as immigrant children, we were much more aware of this perhaps than people whose ancestors had been here for generations. So yes, we were always aware of what was going on over in Europe.
Christine, what was the attitude of your teachers and school administrators toward maybe you as coming from an immigrant family?
I did not feel anything from teachers because, as I said, they were mostly, unfortunately, I lived in what might be considered today to be a ghetto area. As I said, we had distinct groups, and possibly in my grammar school, although I was not aware of it at the time, was predominantly Italian children of immigrants. Whereas if you went, I went to public school 21, if you went down further, if you went to PS 30, you had all of the Chinese students. If you went over to another area, so that you didn't really get anything about this from teachers per se. In school, we were not. And really, I was too young, I think, to really get into war because we didn't have much in the way of history and so forth at the time. We were very conscious of it, don't misunderstand me, but we were still too young and too uninvolved except to feel that we were Americans, and we're very conscious of the fact that we were Americans.
You make a lot of reference to your father. Let me formally introduce your father. Your father was Louis J. Capozzoli. He was a member of the 77th and the 78th United States Congresses, representing the 13th Congressional District from New York City. Now, zeroing in on the congressman, can you recall what his feelings were as a member of Congress at the time we were about to enter war? What were his feelings?
Well, he was very, very pro-United States, and he was very conscious of his obligation as a member of Congress. And we all were. I mean, FDR was our hero, aside from the fact that he did.
Could you explain that statement, Christine? Why was FDR your hero?
Well, you see, the district my father represented was very much a working class district. It was not a farming community. It was not specifically a manufacturing community. And a lot of these people were hit very hard by the Depression. And when FDR came in, he did his best, people felt, to bring us out of the Depression. And there was a lot of legislation passed and so forth. And then, of course, as you got closer and closer to 37, 38, jobs became plentiful because we were starting to supply the world more so. And people's economic condition went up, and they felt really they were Democrats because they were working people, and they felt that the Democratic Party was concerned about them and their well-being. The other thing is FDR was the first president to run for a third term, and some people thought he should not do that. But the majority of the Americans, I think, felt that having someone there who was experienced, who had handled the government for 2 consecutive terms, would know how to deal with the problems of the presidency. And he also ran on 38. We were not involved in the war, 39. And he ran as the president who was going to keep us out of war. And I think a lot of people believe that. And it was the kind of thing you felt FDR cared for you, the little man. And if FDR said, do this, people just felt that they would do it. They had this kind of faith in him. And I think that as a child, I really knew no other president than FDR. And when he eventually died, it was a personal loss to me. It was like a member of my family was going because I didn't know anyone other than him. And I know my dad was very, very impressed with him. He and my mother went to the inauguration, and they went to the inaugural ball. And when my dad was in Congress, I had the opportunity to go to the White House, and I met with Mrs. Roosevelt, which to me was one of the biggest experiences and thrills of my life.
What can you recall about that moment?
I don't think I realized at the time the magnitude of what was happening, the fact that I was presented to her and she shook my hands. But I do remember at one point, you had mentioned my schooling, I did mention to one of my teachers that I was so thrilled I had met Mrs. Roosevelt. And this teacher was like not at all impressed and was not at all pleased. And I was stunned because I thought, here she would say, well, weren't you lucky? You were so happy that you met her. But my dad went back and forth to Congress, and by that time, the war effort had started with the manufacturing stuff. It was very difficult to get hotel rooms and so on. And all of that whole year, early 41, we had the Japanese over here, and Crusoe, I think it was negotiating with our State Department, trying to see if we could keep the Pacific stable, and we were worried about, the French and the English and the Dutch all had colonies and empires over in the Pacific, and we were trying to get guarantees from them that they would not take advantage of the situation.
From the Japanese. Guarantees from the Japanese.
Yes, the Japanese when they started. So I heard about these talks with my dad, and I think when they decided to extend the Neutrality Act towards the end of 41, before the Japanese attack, there was quite a bit of disagreement, because what the president wanted to do was they wanted to send American ships into what they considered war zones. Up to that point, they were saying that we would not do that, we would not get involved. And with the extension of the Neutrality Act, they said they wanted to do that. And I know that my dad voted for the extension, and there was a lot of public opinion that was against him. And I think that was the time that one of the local newspapers had an issue where they had bordered it in black, and they actually listed the members of Congress from New York, Manhattan, who had voted for this, and they felt that these men were going to be responsible for getting us involved in the war. And of course, to just send these ships and not have them armed or not have them go as part of convoys, this was a big, big turmoil. And this happened, as I said, prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And I know my dad felt he had to defend himself from this. And they called them interventionists and isolationists, and they put labels on them. And he gave a speech before Congress saying that he felt he was neither an isolationist or an interventionist, and he detailed why he felt we should do that. He said the Atlantic Ocean is no longer a protection for us with modern transportation and so forth. He said we can't count on that. We have to, defend ourselves. And he also made a reference to Japan. And the speech he gave was in November of 41. And he said that we certainly, not that Japan was a threat, but he felt that we were trying very hard to keep up a relationship with Japan, but we had to at least help the Allies in Europe. And it was very interesting because he made a copy of that speech and at his own expense mailed it out to his congressional district because he felt he had to defend himself against the people who were calling him a warmonger, just like that FDR, president was.
This is a speech that he made in November 1941.
Yes.
And obviously it had to be 1 or 2 weeks prior to the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
That's when it was. Yes. Very interesting. When I read it now, certainly with a lot more interest. But I remember him writing it, and he had no speechwriters. So it had to be his thoughts and how he felt and his ideas, and he would try them out at home. And as a child, we didn't have television at that time. This is what we listened to. It was very interesting.
As the war progressed through 1942, 43, 44, what was life like living in New York City under wartime conditions?
Well, I have to tell you that my mother joined the Civilian Defense League. And as I said, my dad was 40 in 41, and so was my mother. And as children, you can imagine, she would go to the meetings, she came home, and she had a helmet, and she had an armband, and she had a flashlight. We had to black out all of our windows because we were getting ready in case there was an air raid. So forth. Not that we really expected it, but we had to be prepared just in case. And her job was to go out when they would have one of their drills. She would go out and she would walk up and down the streets and see if there was a window where they had not blacked out their light. She also was an airplane spotter. Now, I don't know whether she graduated to this or not, but as I say, the area was pretty much 5-story walk-up apartments. And my mother would go up on the roof, and she would be a spotter with her binoculars to see if she saw any planes in the area. And we thought that was just great, and that my mother actually had to get into the war too. Of course, we had rationing at the time. We had meatless Tuesdays. You couldn't have meat. Butter, sugar. We weren't coffee drinkers, so that didn't bother us. But I remember shoes were rationed, and everything was more. That's when we started using oleomargarine, because oleomargarine at that time could not be manufactured yellow. You got it in a plastic packet, and it had a dye. And you had to actually put the dye into the plastic packet with this greasy looking thing, that was supposed to be a butter substitute. And then you kind of squished it all together till you got this orangey color into it, so it would look like butter and it wouldn't offend the sensibilities, because you really couldn't get much in the way of butter. But to say that I really felt we did without, not really. You made substitutions a lot. But to say that I really felt I did without, in those days too, you didn't have 10 pairs of shoes. As a youngster, in those days, you had your school shoes and you had your Sunday schools. So shoe rationing wasn't really any great loss. The same way today you've got the kids with their play clothes, their school clothes, their dress clothes, they have 16 pairs of sneakers, We didn't have any of that. You just had school shoes and you had, your Sunday school shoes. And when your school shoes got a little bit small, your Sunday shoes got passed down, and it was that kind of a life. So you didn't really feel you were doing without. We did have gas rationing, and I have to say that probably hit us more than most people, because we love to go to the seashore. And with only getting, now you picture this, 3 gallons of gasoline, that was pretty tough.
3 gallons of gasoline per week, per month?
I'm trying to remember. It just seemed to me we never had gas for anything.
In any case, it's a very small amount, right?
It was,
right.
It was. My dad had been driving to Washington originally because it was nice for him to have his car there. It was very difficult getting hotel rooms in Washington once the war started out. And many times he had to go over to Baltimore, to Maryland. But then with the rationing, and even as a member of Congress, he didn't get any extra gas. So he started taking the train down, and then, had to make do whatever he did to get back and forth. Restaurants in Washington, the food was atrocious. It seemed to be everybody started to get involved in making war products. And I remember we had a 38 car that started to give us a lot of trouble when we could get gas to use it. You couldn't get cars, you couldn't get parts.
Christine, as a kid, what were your feelings about the Japanese or toward the Japanese, particularly after Pearl Harbor?
Well, aside from Pearl Harbor, we had a lot of publicity about Bataan, the Death March. We had pictures of what they had gone through, Corregidor. I can't really say, because you see, for me, I could make a distinction between the Italian government and the Italian people. So it was probably a lot easier for me to make a distinction between the Japanese government and the Japanese people, so that I did not harbor any ill feeling toward a Japanese individual, whether it was a naturalized American or not. But I did resent very much the Japanese government, and I think most of us felt that it was a very, very dastardly thing to do. You have your people over here talking peace with us and so forth, and then you have planned this attack for months on end. I mean, it was just a terrible thing as far as we were concerned. But it was the catalyst. it did get the whole country. All of a sudden, you kind of forgot a lot of what was separating you. You know, the farmer had had a pretty hard time during Depression. And again, as I say, a lot of this is hearsay. You have to bear with me. I can't, back up a lot of it with facts. But then again, when we became the breadbasket for the world and so forth, and the farmer was starting, to come back up again. But we still, lost my train of thought. That's terrible. But I did not, we all kind of grouped together that we had to lick the enemies. And this, unfortunately, was one of the times. But I think in New York, the people almost wanted to do more because we didn't have any big defense factories. We had the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but it was mostly for repairs. It wasn't a case that we were building ships. And I think everybody just wanted to get into the war effort. They wanted to do their share. There was a tremendous feeling of patriotism. And I can remember that every Sunday, it seemed to me, I would go with my dad, and they would have what they called flag raisings. And you would have a street, and there would be apartment buildings on one side and apartment buildings on the other side. And everyone at that time, if you had someone in service, you would have a little flag in your window, and it would have a blue star for someone who was alive fighting overseas, and unfortunately, it was replaced by a gold star. Well, we would have these...
A gold star if
someone
the
was...
son or daughter was lost.
Yes, if someone was killed. But at the beginning of the war, as a congressman, my father would go and he would speak at all these flag raisings, and you'd have all the people coming out of their buildings, lining each side of the street and in the street itself, and they would raise this flag. They would have a rope, great big flag, quite large, and it would be across the street. It would just hang there, and they would have blue stars for all of the boys who were in the armed forces, and again, unfortunately, the gold stars. And people were very patriotic, and they were very proud of it, and they wanted to do their share. But there was a little bit of this price gouging, too, which unfortunately comes up all the time, and food prices went through the ceiling, as you can imagine, and they were trying with government subsidies to keep them down. And most of the shipyards, I think, were built further west, out on the Pacific coast. I don't know why that happened. Maybe there was more land available, I don't know. But they had to watch. We had a coal strike, and Congress was also involved in a railroad strike. We had to be concerned about labor, for example. Sabotage, yes, they worried about sabotage. But, these labor unions, don't forget they had had a very tough time during the Depression. And now there was a little part of them that felt they had to make their money while they could because they had, so you did have this divisiveness. But I think with Pearl Harbor, a lot of it stopped. I think people just felt that we had to work together.
Christine, your uncle who was shot down over Germany, whatever happened to him?
In those days, they didn't worry about anyone having any kind of psychological problems. They just took you back and said, it's
So he did
over.
return from
He returned.
Germany.
He was one of two on that plane. And what happened was he was a tail gunner. So in order for him to get to the point where he could parachute out, he had to go from the tail, crawl on his belly all the way to where he got to a wider part of the plane and he could parachute down. So what happened, they took some flak that separated the tail from the plane. And as a result, he was knocked senseless for, I don't know, he doesn't know himself how many seconds. and then his chute opened automatically, and he was able to parachute down. He was captured by the Germans, went to a POW camp. He and I think one other on the plane survived, and the rest of them all went down. But, you know, it was just interesting because it just wasn't his time, and you heard so many of these stories. And, you know, we had friends, the Battle of the Bulge. I can't tell you the Battle of the Bulge, how excited we were in school. You know, we used to have air raid drills in school. We had to crawl under our desks and cover our head, you know, and so forth and so on, which we thought was great fun at the time. But the Battle of the Bulge, I remember when the Germans came and they surrounded our troops and so forth, and we couldn't get any kind of shelter for them or assistance for them because of the weather. And every day I would wake up and I remember saying, did they surrender yet? Did they? And we'd go to school, and we were all just so impressed that they were able to hold out the way they did. You know, I mean, there was just such a feeling of support, of you know, our boys were just wonderful, you know, what they did and so forth. It was just, it was a difficult time, but there was a time of great patriotism and great concern for each other, I think.
Was he captured by the Germans initially, or was he captured by...
He was captured, to my knowledge, by the Germans, but it was the end of the war, and they knew they did not mistreat him because they knew that the Americans were coming in, and so that they captured him, and he was put into a camp, but was released shortly thereafter. He was the last plane shot down before the end of the war.
In your words, the I generation. Would they ever be able to rise to the occasion to defend this nation if indeed we were threatened like we were in the early 40s?
That's a difficult question. I'd like to say yes, I do. I think, unfortunately, I'm a retired school teacher, and unfortunately we learn about all the youngsters who are problems. There are so many people who do the right thing, have the right values, you know, and so forth. And I really feel they're the ones that are not publicized. But I honestly do believe, being in a school, I see all the youngsters who do the right thing every day. And they do it only because they feel it's the right thing. And I do. I really believe in my heart, yes, that if the time came that they would do that.